Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to one of our last events in the series of the CBEL events this year. So today is the Young Scholars Workshop. I will begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land on which we gather today and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. I also extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander who may be present today. I'm very pleased today to have gathered a group of very distinguished speakers who are present with us today to discuss on the various topics. So this Young Scholar Workshop, the aim is really to provide a platform for our early career academics who is selected from a very competitive call for paper process to share with us their latest research on issues that are critical to the global economic governance. So on this panel, we have very divergent topics that will address some of the important challenges of the international economic legal order, including climate actions, national security, digital trade, and public health. So I will present the speaker in the order in which they will speak. Each of the speaker will have about 15 minutes of the presentation. And in the end, we will have time for some Q&A sessions. So if you have any questions as the speakers present, then you can post it in the Q&A sessions. After the speakers present, we also are very honored to have Professor Michelle Badin with us, who will make comments for about 20 minutes, then we'll open up for questions. So I'll start with presenting our first speaker, Ms. Pallavi Arora. Pallavi Arora is a legal consultant at the Center for the WTO Studies, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. She holds an LLM in International Trade and Investment Law from Maastricht University, which she also pursued as UN Holland High Potential Scholar. She also holds an MPhil in International Legal Studies and an undergrad degree in law. Previously, she worked as an assistant professor in public international law at the University of Petroleum and Energy Studies and a senior research fellow at the Center for WTO Studies. Her main fields of research include international economic law with a focus on intellectual property rights and critical approach to international law. So today she will present to us on the topic of common concern of humankind and dissemination of technology, the case for tax breaks. Pallavi, the floor is yours.
Hello and greetings, everyone. Thank you for the very warm welcome, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to be talking to you today about how tax breaks by the home country of innovator companies can facilitate voluntary licensing of clean technologies to developing countries on fair and reasonable, and would be grounding much of this proposal in the doctrine of mankind. Next slide, please. Yes, thanks. So in light of the impending climate crisis, countries are increasingly employing trade policy tools to achieve climate goals. Notable in this regard is the turn to non-product related process and production methods, or NPR-PPMs, as the basis to impose import restrictions and differential taxation between products made from fossil fuels and renewable energy. We see this in the recent regulations of the European Union, the CBAM, the deforestation-free products, ensuing dialogue at the WTO on plastics pollution, and the sustainability chapters in free trade. The United States Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's Green Deal Industrial Plan have revived calls for amending the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures to allow for local content requirements and export contingent subsidies for climate action. However, developing countries such as India, China, Brazil, South Africa, among others, have opposed the integration of sustainability concerns into trade policy. And their approach is largely like EO debates, where developing countries saw the very nature and purpose of trade regulation as promoting industrial catch-up. And they somehow considered issues of sustainability as falling outside the realm of trade policy. Now, one may argue that developing country members of the WTO who depend on fossil fuel production will impose import restrictions, differential taxation, and other incentives if treatment less favorable is not compensated by incentives to bring about new technologies for renewables to their country. The support for renewable energy by industrialized countries has greatly increased the technology and the resistance to this debate from developing countries. Hence, measures linking trade policy with sustainability goals would gain political acceptance only if they're linked to the provision of climate finance and the transfer of low carbon technologies to promote sustainable production in developing countries. Now, developing countries have broadly identified two factors as significant hurdles to. The first is intellectual property rights, and the second is the lack of finance. When it comes to the former, developing countries argue that IP monopolies impede the diffusion and development of technology within their territories. This is because the bargaining power is broadly tipped in favor of the IP owner, who gets to dictate aspects like the cost of the proprietary product and the countries and manufacturers covered by the licensing agreement. Developing countries do not have the necessary institutional and financial resources to negotiate licenses under such prohibitive terms, making access to ESTs difficult for them. In addition to IP, developing countries have also raised the lack of finance as a formidable barrier to accessing ESTs, or environmentally sound technologies. These barriers encompass high technology costs, affordability issues, and difficulty in accessing finance due to lack of interest from private sector banks and financiers. Now, while these concerns have been on the table and incorporated in the UN SDGs, no concrete steps have been taken to mitigate them. The most ambitious proposal on technology transfer actually emerged in the era, which was the draft Code of Conduct on the Transfer of Technology of 1985. I sense that my internet will be better as we go. So it was the draft Code of Conduct on the Transfer of Technology of 1985. However, this document never quite saw the light of the day. Meanwhile, the TRIPS agreement also takes a largely hortatory approach to the meaningful transfer of technology to developing countries. Next slide, please. Now, many claim that the TRIPS agreement provides sufficient flexibility to aid technology transfer to developing countries. Nevertheless, there are several reasons to challenge this claim. To begin with, compulsory licensing is cited as an important flexibility under the TRIPS agreement. However, in addition to being seen by IP holders as a draconian measure, compulsory licensing also does not include the know-how or the undisclosed information which is associated with a patent, and this is protected as a trade secret, and this makes access to technology very difficult. The TRIPS agreement also has certain non-binding provisions that relate to facilitating technology transfer. Among these provisions are the preamble to the TRIPS agreement and Article 7, which strive to achieve a balance between IP protection and technology transfer. Then there's Article 8.2 and 40.2 of the TRIPS agreement, which provide that members have the flexibility to take measures to prevent the abuse of IP rights, such as abusive voluntary licensing practices through competition law or other means. However, these provisions have by and large failed to increase the transfer of technology to developing countries due to their non-binding nature. Then there's the famous Article 66. Which is a relevant provision that calls upon developed countries to grant incentives to their firms to facilitate technology transfer to least developed countries. However, LDCs have put into question the effectiveness of this provision, citing the lack of any meaningful technology transfer from developed countries, despite the binding or mandatory nature has been to stress on compulsory licensing. How does it not work when the technology is requires access to essential information? A more effective approach may be to focus on cooperation towards making available the necessary funding to implement voluntary licensing. However, the problem here is that climate financing from industrialized to developing countries has not come through. And this is primarily because public funding is scarce and industrialized countries are reluctant to make more money going through budgetary allocations to fund climate efforts abroad in developing countries. The current scenario has presented an opportunity for innovative thinking to provide funding to facilitate more affordable licensing of low carbon technologies to developing countries. Some ideas that have been developed so far include export credit support for trade in low carbon technology products or revenue recycling in the context of the EU's proposed CBAM measure. However, an idea that has not yet been fully explored is the provision of tax breaks by the home government of the innovator company upon the export of sustainable tech to development. More in the context of tax breaks, it is essentially more in the nature of tax incentives that are provided to promote exports by the source country to attract FDI, or it is in the context of double taxation avoidance, are not related to legal obligations on the home government of innovator companies for technology dissemination to developing countries. Given this background, an important consideration going forward is to explore ways in which the disconnect between the fields of international trade, climate and trade law can be bridged in order to support financing of low carbon technology exports to developing countries. And this calls for innovative thinking on designing a scheme for the provision of tax privileges by the home government of innovator companies for technology dissemination to developing countries. Next slide, please. Now, the normative framework for making this claim is the doctrine of common concern of humankind in this paper. A common concern of humankind is a shared and unresolved problem that can only be tackled through cooperation. The doctrine has been recognized in relation to climate change, biodiversity, health, and cultural diversity. Now, in the present context, transfer of technology in general is not really a common concern. What is a common concern of humankind is the inhibition of wide diffusion of low carbon technologies, particularly to developing countries, as it hinders effective, adequate, and timely climate mitigation from taking place globally. So this is what is going to be considered as a common concern of humankind. And under this framing, access to innovation and technology would not only be seen as a competitive edge of developed countries over developing countries in international trade. Rather, technology dissemination required to support a shift to NPR PPMs for sustainable modes of production would be seen in the interest of both developed and developing countries. Now, this is a doctrine that has been fleshed out in some detail by Professor Thomas Gautier. He basically highlights three interrelated channels that guide stakeholders in responding to such concerns. It begins with the responsibility to cooperate internationally and take appropriate domestic measures when a common concern arises. And if cooperation is not successful or appropriate domestic measures are not taken, thank you. Okay, so now let's see how the home government of innovator companies could design tax breaks to promote the dissemination of sustainable technology to developing countries. The first is through the provision of export incentives. Now, tax cost may arise in the home country of innovator companies when transferring technology property. When transferring technology property to a foreign company. And the following are considered to be income for taxation purposes in the home country. So if there's a disposal of a capital asset, if there's a disposal of a capital asset, then it could result in a taxable capital gain, or there could be a recapture of depreciation, or there could be income from intellectual property in the form of licensing fees, royalties, sales of goods and services that incorporate an IP, or even patent infringement damages. Now, tax breaks could be given in the form of tax credits where the entire tax could be waived, or it could be a tax allowance up to a certain amount, or it could be a tax deferral where the tax payment could be delayed. Now, an UNCTAD study notes that such tax breaks have already been provided in some form by countries such as India, Japan, Korea, and Sri Lanka. And next slide, please. One of the could I request you to mind? Thanks. So one of the ways that it could be further affected is through the patent box system in Europe. Now, the patent box system essentially provides tax breaks to companies on IP-generated income from foreign markets in relation to eligible types of IP such as patents and software copyrights. And about 13 EU countries have implemented this measure, and a number of non-EU countries like the UK, Switzerland, etc. also have a patent box system. So now, so for example, countries like Turkey provided 12.5% tax break on any IP generated income from abroad. And in 2021, Italy removed its patent box system and introduced a super deduction allowance, which allows for a 230% deduction in expenses related to research and development. So it's kind of a change or move from income-based patent box system to an investment or R&D-based super deduction model. So essentially, this patent box system could be adjusted by offering tax breaks to companies that enter into voluntary licensing agreements with companies in developing countries to transfer low carbon technologies on mutually agreed fair and reasonable terms. And this could apply to technology exports to eligible developing countries that could be culled out from the World Development Indicators. And likewise, tax incentives could be provided also for carrying out R&D activities in developing countries. There's another element of tax sparing credits, which in light of paucity of time, I think I will reserve my comments on for now. But could I request you to switch to my last slide, please? So now the broad question is about the WTO compatibility of these measures, because they're going to be more in the nature of export contingent subsidies. Currently, under the scheme of Article 3 of the SCM agreement, they could very well be considered prohibited subsidies. This is particularly true even in the context of Item E of Annex 1 of the SCM agreement, which makes clear that the full or partial exemption of direct taxes specifically related to exports constitute a prohibited subsidy. And therefore, going forward in the interim, if countries do take such measures, then a waiver could be adopted under Article 9, Para 4 of the WTO agreement to allow countries to adopt for these measures. And in the long run, the category of non-actionable subsidies under Article 8 of the SCM agreement could be reintroduced to allow countries to provide tax for dissemination of technology to developing countries. So this was broadly my presentation, and I look forward to your suggestions, comments, and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation on a very important topic of climate action, and from an interesting angle, the tax breaks as a way to support financing of low carbon technology export to developing countries. And you've raised a few interesting ideas, including this normative framework of the common concern of humankind as a basis. And it addresses also important, I think, theoretical questions and a way to bridge this disconnect between different fields, right? International tax, climate, and trade law. So I'm sure we have quite a few questions that we wanted to raise, and maybe we have also comments, but we'll come back to you later. And now we would like to move on to our next speaker. So So now one of our speakers have some technology issues, Dr. Chu Xiaomeng, so we'll see if she will be able to join us in time. But for now, we will be moving first to our next speaker, Dr. Xinyue Li. So Dr. Xinyue Li is an associate researcher at the School of International Law, East China University of Political Science and Law. And she got the PhD in law at Durham University, where she was also the senior tutor of law, associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy, deputy director of the Center for Chinese Law and Policy, and global citizenship program scholar at Ustinov College. She was also a visiting PhD scholar at University of Cambridge, and her research interests include international law, economic security, e-reconciliation, and quantum legal theory. So today she will be presenting on pluralistic reconciliation or relative political politicization, emerging energy security in international trade law through quantizing geoeconomics. So without further ado, I will pass the floor now to Xinyue.
Good afternoon, also good morning and good evening for everybody who joined me this today. So thank you for being here with me to have a very lovely conversation on my research with a very long and complicated title. So before I start sharing my my research, I just want to say this is actually the first time that my research has been accepted to present at the Civil Center. So it is highly selective. So congratulations to everyone being here with me. But as I already mentioned earlier, I do have a long and very lovely history with civil because I obtained my second Master of Law at UNSW in 2018. And that's when I met the co-director Wei Huan and also Professor Han Wang, who has already moved to Singapore. So please, everybody, go easy on the comment, but also do not hold any fire. So what is the key research question for my research? For me, I've been delving into the question of the reconciliation between national security and economic liberalization for nearly 7 years. And so on that journey, I find that the current scholarships has not been very sufficient to offer a way towards reconciliation between national security and economic liberalization. So for me, further down the study, I also noticed that the international economic law should not be limited intellectually within its own school of thoughts. So those are the two motivations for me to really trying to look at the irreconciliation between national security and economic liberalization with a crossing field of international relations and also quantum theories as the fundamental philosophy. So you may ask, why choose quantum theories? Well, actually, quantum theories at the beginning, it was born to have two different functions. The first is to work as a physics mechanics, and the second is to work as a philosophy for people to actually reflect on the existing, to reflect on why we live the way we live. And before quantum theories, we also have Newtonic classical physics, right? And so the contemporary social science actually all are built on the foundation of Newtonic classical philosophies. For example, we have economics to suggest that if we're following the certain pattern, then we have an outcome of certain society. So the fundamental logic here is that as long as we follow the foundation, we follow the fundamental law, we will have that kind of consequences, we'll have that kind of outcome. And all of those kind of philosophy are built upon the classical Newtonian kinds of mindset. And later on in the last century, we have quantum theories, which suggest a completely different kind of philosophy, that everything is chaotic and we have different kinds of probabilities. And so at that moment, people in social science has again started to reflect on the way social science can develop. And in 1989, the Harvard Law Review published an article by Lawrence Tribe suggesting why lawyers need to learn from physics. So that is the first article ever talking about how the physics kind of philosophy can be applied to the constitutional law paradigm. And later on in 2015, we have Alexander Wins in the field of international relations to suggest a scholarship called quantum international relations. And Alexander Wins and with also other international relations scholars have developed 3 different courses to build a quantum international relations, which inspired my research on use quantum theories to interpret geoeconomics and then to apply those kind of theoretical framework in the field of international economic law and also international law. So how does quantizing geoeconomics works? So again, the 3 courses I applied here are first, analogy, second, ontology or actuality, and third, quantizing poster critic. So first, analogy. The frequently used narratives is A is like a quantum system. So basically, we're here trying to use quantum theories to use as analogies or metaphors to have some kind of implication. And the second is ontology. That means to use quantum theories, to use quantum worldview as a fundamental ontology to understand being and existing. And the third quantizing poster critic is very easy to understand, is to use quantum theories as a way of critical study the existing conventional scholarship on international law. And along the way of building this kind of very exotic and a little bit strange theoretical framework, which is quantizing geoeconomics, I have received 2 criticisms. The first is on this kind of conceptual project, because geoeconomics narratives lacks applicabilities to humankind's common concerns, which we already talked about that before, such as energy security, such as climate change, and such as pandemic. And the second criticisms focus on the normative class project. So meaning this kind of very exotic theoretical framework maybe does not generate normative benefits and practical contributions for international legal practice. So based on those 2 criticisms, I developed this paper, which talks about energy security matters. And for everybody who's here today, I know that we all have a shared understanding on why energy security matters, so I'm not going to address it further. And in my research, I reveals 2 different kinds of incompatibilities between what is conceived as old and what is conceived as new in the field of energy security. The first set relates to the inability of the traditional understanding of energy security to incorporate the convergence of short and the long-term energy security in the clean energy transition. And the second relates to the inability of both the national security-centered approach and the continuums of energy security to holistically comprehend energy as a security issue in an emerging geoeconomic order. And those incompatibilities are among the new shifts in economic policy that bring into question some traditional understandings of the international trade law, which also challenge the diverse normative foundation of the energy security practice in international trade law. And in the field of international trade law specifically, we normally consider energy security as an emerging aspect of national security, a sub-provision of exception clauses. So the whole applying this kind of clauses in real issues always entails and weighing and balancing between sovereign right of energy security protection against trade liberalization. The next step I do is to delve into 3 different questions. First, how did member states employ energy security to justify trade restrictive measures? Second, how did panels interact with justifications on the ground of energy security? And third, what are the deficiencies of the energy security jurisprudence provided by the WTO DSB? And the research reveals distinct deficiencies in the jurisprudence on energy security. Because first, the direct accommodation of energy security under GATT Article 20J, products in general or local short supply, is equipped with a very high threshold that only concerns the short-term security of energy supply with minimum geopolitical influence, which does not suit the current situation. And second, the indirect involvement of energy security under GATS Article 20D, secure compliance with laws and regulations, is subjected to judicial overreaching or misunderstanding. And third, the other indirect involvement of energy security under GATS 14A, protect public order, despite it has a very low invocation threshold, but it can only be potentially justified based on a very strategically constructed definition for energy security. And finally, energy security objectives have not been justified under security exceptions and also general principles, such as the freedom of transit, which leave both challenges and opportunities for future dispute settlement. And currently, the literatures have only focused on how to address those practical difficulties in a very technical manner, which is not sufficient because we are currently facing the trilemma in the field of international legal order. Then what are those trilemmas? First, we have an expansion of security areas such as energy security and emerging AI security and quantum security and so on, covered by international economic rules. And second, we also have the rise of novel approaches such as geoeconomics, such as multi-level governance theories, such as global pluralism to economic security norm creation. And third, the steady disintegration of the traditional binaries, such as those between legalism and realism, such as between the kind of mindset of us versus them, and also between normativity and concreteness. All of them are challenging the traditional normative underpinning of international economic law. And this is where my theoretical framework, quantitative geoeconomics, can contribute. So by using first quantum measurement theory on the analogical level, it recognizes the convergence on energy security probabilities and thus provide theoretical groundings for the integration of traditional short and long-term separations for energy security. And second, by use quantum holism theories on the ontological level, it situates energy security within the geoeconomic order with holographical characteristics, targeting the energy security paradigms resulting from energy securitization and the omission of the rising geoeconomic order from the energy governance perspective, which are the two drawbacks of the national security-centered approach and the continuum energy security approach. And third, quantitative geoeconomics further seeks to promote a better understanding on jurisprudence binaries, particularly between the legalism and the realism, and it also proposed an inclusive legal ideology for the pluralistic reconciliation of what seems irreconcilable under conventional scholarship and perceptions. And lastly, the primary normative payoffs of pluralistic reconciliation through quantitative geoeconomics is the rejection of the one coherent programs for the world order, considering it offers an open realism, quantum-based, and diverse sympathetic model. So its practical implications are manifested by providing a novel given code in the sense of a universalized legal ideology as a supplement to existing practice code for international law scholars and practitioners to innovatively comprehend the new energy security dynamics. And because of the time limit today, so I don't really have the time or the luxury to dive into how the quantum philosophies, or including measurement, entanglement, and holisms can be applied in international law. But further on, my research will be focused on quantum international law, which is a very micro-leveled construct. So please follow my research. In the end, the value that I'm trying to highlight here is that international law is what we make of it. And there is a background here, which is captioned as, in me, the tiger sniffs the rose. So doing multidisciplinary research is full of challenges, as I already said at the beginning of my research. But there are a lot of fun, and there are a lot of creative thinking, and there will be have these kind of opportunities to engage with conversations with people in different disciplines. So I highly recommend everybody to really try to adopt doctrinal-based methodologies that incorporate theoretical and interdisciplinary studies. And it also would embody more probabilities to reconceptualizing, repurposing, and reframing the existing international legal order towards a more humble, pluralistic, and inclusive structure, which is what we really need in this current transitioning period. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to further discussions and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very enlightening presentation, and I think it's a really an important and ambitious and also innovative project that you attempt to use a multidisciplinary approach, importing those quantum theories and with I think an innovative framework, are trying to use this quantizing geoeconomics to address some of the emerging issues, such as the energy security issues in international law. So this is a very exciting and interesting paper. I'd like to hear more if we have time for further discussions. So for now, we would like to move on to our next speaker and maybe come back to you later during the Q&As. So our speaker, Dr. Qu Xiaomeng, had some connection issues. We will, perhaps if she was not able to join us in time during the session, we will then include a recorded version of her presentation to share with all the participants, so you will be able to see her a very interesting paper later. In order not to delay our session, we would like now to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Ms. Yi Tang. Tang Yi is a PhD candidate at Hong Kong University Faculty of Law, where she also got the MPhil and double bachelor degree in government and law and also LLB. Her academic interests include international investment law and arbitration, dispute resolution, comparative law, cross-border legal issues, with a particular focus on China. She works has appeared both in English and Chinese journals, and her current PhD research focuses on tension between public and private interests in investor-state dispute settlement mechanism in times of public health crisis. So this is, again, a very timely topic. So today she will speak on the topic responding to global health crisis, opportunities and challenges for reforming global public policy exception in the Asian Pacific international and investment agreements. So Dr. Tang Yi, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for Professor Fan's very kind introduction. And I'm also very grateful for all the support provided by the CBO's administrative team. It's really my great honor and pleasure to join today's workshop. So the title of the working paper that I am presenting today is Responding to Global Health Crisis, Opportunities and Challenges for Reforming General Public Policy Exceptions in International Investment Agreements. First, I would like to apologize for the slight difference between the current title and the title of my previously submitted abstract. This is because after I finished the draft full paper, I realized that there may not be an obvious regional Asian Pacific pattern that I originally anticipated. So the general focus will be more placed on the overall treaty regime for today's presentation. Next slide, please. My presentation today will be mainly divided into 4 parts. So first, I will provide a conceptual clarification, defining what does the term general public policy exceptions mean in my article. And second, from the perspective of treaty making practice, my paper empirically surveys the use or the incorporation of general public policy exceptions in international investment agreements. And third, from the aspect of arbitral jurisprudence, I will look into how the arbitral tribunals interpret and apply the general public policy exceptions in ISDS cases. Finally, I will talk about the relevance and significance of the general public policy exceptions under the context of COVID-19 crisis. And I will also make some concluding remarks at the end if I have time. To make a conceptual clarification, I would like to briefly mention at the beginning that there are different types of exceptions clauses in IIAs. And in the existing literature, different scholars may have different ways of categorizing these exceptions clauses. The table here just briefly shows some examples of different categorization of these exceptions clauses, but I will not go into the details here due to the time limit. For my draft paper, it intends to focus solely on one particular type, i.e. the general public policy exceptions clauses. As Dr. Xingyue has just mentioned, Article 20 of the General Agreement on Tariffs Trade and Article 14 of the General Agreement on Trade in Services, these are also the two articles of my draft. These are also the focus of my draft paper here. So to defining the general public policy exceptions clauses, I specifically refer to those articles modeled on Article 20 of the GATT or Article 14 of the GATT. In other words, the general public policy exceptions discussed in my draft paper specifically refer to the WTO-style general exceptions incorporated into the IIAs. Next slide, please. So Article 20 of the GATT provides in part that subject to the requirement that such measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail or a disguised restriction on international trade. Nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent the adoption or enforcement by any contracting party of measures necessary to protect public morals, necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, imposed for the protection of national treasures of artistic, historic, or archaeological value, relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. To elaborate, this article of general exceptions consists of two distinct parts. First, there are 10 enumerated exceptions listed in paragraphs A through J. And second, there is an introductory provision at the beginning, known as the chapeau. For the enumerated exceptions, this article provides an exhaustive list of permissible policy objectives, and the chapeau emphasizes the application of the measure in question. Additionally, a similarly worded general exceptions clause can be found in Article 14 of the GATT, but to avoid repetitiveness, I just focus on the GATT here. Next slide, please. In a number of WTO cases, the WTO panel and the appellate body have clarified the method by which these general exceptions provision has been interpreted. So the WTO system has established a two-tiered review of the general exceptions clause. First, whether the measure can be justified under one of the enumerated exceptions. And second, whether the application of the measure meets the requirements of the chapeau. And more specifically, the first tier could be further broken into two steps. First, whether the measure in question falls within the range of policy objective. And second, does the measure satisfy the nexus requirement of it being necessary or relating to the pursuit of the policy objective in question? In this sense, the two-tiered review could also be regarded as a three-step analysis. Next slide, please. After clarifying the definition and anatomy of general exceptions clauses, now I will turn to introduce the empirical investigation of the use of general public policy exceptions in the existing IIA's treaty practice. So overall speaking, up to 2022, the total number of IIAs in force around the world is over 2,500. And as the figure shows, the 1990s witnesses a massive proliferation of IIAs. Next slide, please. With particular regard to the general public policy exceptions in the IIAs, it is found that only a minority of IIAs currently contain such clauses, but their share is gradually growing. Based on the statistics collected by the electronic database of investment treaties, the so-called EDIT, of all the IIAs, only around 15% contain such exceptions clauses. But although the use of these exceptions in IIAs is uncommon, there emerges a rising trend. And moreover, the UNCTAD report reveals that general public policy exceptions are largely missing in old generation IIAs, but they are increasingly common in recently concluded new IIAs. Next slide, please. And to talk more about the recent proliferation trend, we could take the IIAs newly concluded in the recent years as examples. So for the IIAs concluded in 2018, 2019, and 2020, of all the IIAs reviewed in each year, the IIAs contained general public policy exceptions account for 40%, 38%, and 47% respectively. Next slide, please. And geographically speaking, it is observed that the proponents of incorporating general public policy exceptions in IIAs are actually quite diverse, which is the reason why it's somehow difficult to identify a specific geographical or regional pattern. However, in my paper, I argue that one specific state, Canada, and one particular region, Asia, are actually noteworthy here. So when it comes to state treaty practice of incorporating the WTO-style general public policy exceptions clauses in IIAs, the most salient example is Canada. Canada began including this type of exceptions clause in its IIAs since 1990s. It incorporated such provision into its 2004 Model BIT. And this clause was also adopted in the IIAs concluded later on, such as Article 10 of the Canada-Peru BIT. And if we compare these Canadian general public policy exception clause listed here with the aforementioned Article 20 of the GATT, we will find that they are indeed very similar. So they follow the same structure. First, it lists an exhaustive set of permissible public policy objectives. And second, the clause also includes a chapeau here. Next slide, please. And apart from Canada, a number of Asian countries have also incorporated general public policy exceptions clauses in their IIAs, and specifically in comprehensive bilateral free trade agreements signed between Asian countries. To be more specific, these Asian states have designed their WTO-style general public policy exceptions provisions in the following three particular ways. The first approach is to incorporate general public policy exceptions clauses drawing upon either the entirety or specific parts of Article 20 of the GATT. And the second approach is to incorporate Article 14 of the GATT. And the third approach is to incorporate both Article 20 of the GATT and Article 14 of the GATT. As the table here shows, for each one of these three approaches, we could find some Asian FTA examples that actually adopted that particular approach. And to summarize, the findings of the empirical investigation are mainly threefolded. First, in the overall universe of IIAs, which is currently dominated by old generation IIAs, the incorporation of WTO-style general public policy exceptions is still in minority. And second, focusing on the new generation IIAs, the inclusion of general public policy exceptions has becoming increasingly common and popular. And finally, from the perspective of state practice, this investigation has identified some leaders or trendsetters in incorporating general public policy exceptions in IIAs, such as Canada and some Asian countries like Japan or Singapore. Next slide, please. So, after empirically reviewing the inclusion of general public policy exceptions in IIA's treaty practice, my paper also discusses the arbitral case law, attempting to figure out how the arbitral tribunals interpret and apply the general public policy exceptions in practice. And up to now, the arbitral case law addressing general public policy exceptions clauses is relatively scarce. And my paper focuses on 3 arbitral awards that have directly interpreted general public policy exceptions. The first known investment arbitration case dealing with general public policy exception is the so-called Copa Mesa versus Ecuador. And the second case is Bear Creek versus Peru. And the most recent one is Eco-Aura versus Colombia. Next slide, please. Due to the time limit, I probably will not go into the details of all these cases, but it is worth mentioning here that all of these 3 arbitral awards have actually triggered a lot of criticisms. For example, the tribunals in the first 2 cases both encountered a complicated problem regarding the interplay between 2 different defenses, namely the doctrine of police powers and the general public policy exceptions. It seems that the Copa Mesa Tribunal treated these 2 defenses as distinct yet factually related defenses. But the Bear Creek Tribunal in the second case held that the general exceptions applied as lex specialis to the exclusion of any other defenses under international law, including the police powers. However, it is criticized that neither tribunal thoroughly elucidated the rationale behind their interpretation. And the tribunals just swiftly concluded that procedural deficiencies in the host state's interactions with foreign investors violated the primary obligations and the requirements set out in the chapel of the exceptions, and without carefully or clearly explaining the normative boundaries of these defenses. And the most recent case of Eco-Aura is probably more controversial. The tribunal in this case held that even if the general exceptions clause applies to a state's measure, this does not prevent an investor claiming that such a measure entitles it to the payment of compensation. This is very controversial, and some commentators even criticized that the tribunal's interpretation on the general public policy exceptions has rendered this provision effectively irrelevant in investment arbitration. So the respondent states in all the 3 cases have failed to invoke the general public policy exceptions contained in the IIAs. And these 3 cases have demonstrated that the arbitral tribunal's interpretation and the application of the general public policy exceptions are problematic and controversial. Next slide, please. So in the post-COVID era, it is predicted that the world is likely to face a deluge of investor-state disputes or claims relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, many potential ISDS cases have already been considered or discussed. For example, it is reported that some states, such as Peru, Chile, Mexico, Italy, and Spain, have faced greater investment arbitration risks relating to their regulatory measures taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this regard, my paper argues that the general public policy exceptions clauses in the IIAs may be of particular relevance to responding to the COVID-19 crisis, because these type of exceptions clauses have explicitly listed protecting human health as a permissible policy objective, which means that the regulatory measures generally taken for the purpose of combating COVID-19 may fall within the scope of the general public policy exceptions clauses. And in other words, faced with the potential ISDS claims related to the COVID-19 emergency measures, host states may invoke the general public policy exceptions as treaty-based defense. However, in practice, the states may still face great difficulties or challenges when invoking such exceptions clauses. This is because, first, from the perspective of IIA's treaty practice, the current IIA regime is still dominated by the old generation IIAs, where these kind of exceptions are lacking. And second, from the perspective of arbitral jurisprudence, there seems to exist a high degree of uncertainty as to how investment arbitral tribunals will interpret and apply the general exceptions clauses in the COVID-19 context. I think I have exceeded the time limit, and I will just stop here. I only have one last slide of concluding remarks. I think I could leave that conclusion for the discussion later if I have time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. on a very important and timely topic. As we see from the recent pandemic, it addresses a very timely issue of the global public health crisis. And so you've made a comprehensive analysis on the treaty survey and also how it applies by the arbitral practice. And I think it also raises some broader challenges in the ISDS more generally, right? So the conflict norms in international law, the conflicts of considerations from investment protection on the one hand, and also other public law considerations. So public health is one aspect. Then we have also, the climate consideration, human rights, other considerations. So how to coordinate those different and conflict norms in international law. It also raises question on what's the role of international arbitrators, as we see from some of the controversial cases you just quoted. So I think it's of important practical and theoretical importance, and hopefully we'll have time to come back to you later during the Q&A sessions. So I understand that we are generating the video recording of Dr. Qu Xiaomeng. Hopefully it will be available shortly. For the time being, so I will now first invite our commentator, Professor Michelle Badin, to make her comments. Professor Badin is an assistant professor at FGV San Paulo School of Law and its Law and Development Postgraduate Program, coordinator of the FGV SP Center of Global Law and Development, and also of the WTO chair in Brazil. She's the current director of the Red Latino Americana de Derecho Económico Internacional. Excuse me for the pronunciation, but she's the center director and also of the Brazilian chapter of International Law Association and a founding member of the Society of International Economic Law. So she have generated very important scholarship. A few of them I have read with great interest. So we're very honored today to have her with us today and to offer some of her observations and comments. So Michelle, the floor is yours.
So thank you for this introduction, Professor Kuhn. It's an immense pleasure to join the CIBEL Global Network Conference from Brazil. Although I would enjoy much more being in the same place and time zone as you, it is a privilege to be part of this virtual exchange of ideas. And I must confess that being in this all-female panel is a joyful surprise. I learned much from reading the papers selected for this Young Scholar workshop. I congratulate the writers who have just detailed their ongoing research. The 4 pieces are high-spirited and fearless in proposing new thinking in the international economic law field. They are all work on contemporary challenges to the international trade investment systems and offer detailed case analysis to amplify our repertoire to address them. Departing from the provoking title for the conference, Reshaping the Global Economic Governance, I would like first to address shared concerns I identified in the 4 papers. And in the second part of my comments, I will elect 1-2 questions and comments to each author, if you allow me. My first highlight is to question, where should we reshape the rules and proceedings for a better global economic governance? Pallavi suggests us looking at the multilateral system of the WTO. According to her, reforming the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement may provide better opportunities for environmentally sound technology and its dissemination to developing countries. Who unfortunately could not join us, but on the other hand, she described how regional and thematic agreements as alternatives to the WTO have allowed better dealings for the international digital regulation, with the notorious advantage of circumscribing the negotiation to a specialized topic, the openness of such type of arrangements to new members, flexibility in adopting the commitments, and the provisions for inclusion of least developed countries. Asian countries have been leaders in international initiatives for the digital regulation and may help to empower global perspectives. Itang analyzes the bilateral framework for investment promotion and protection and how they have responded to global health crisis. Her conclusion is not optimistic, neither about the capacity of current rules to deal with the crisis, nor about their interpretation. I'd like to reverse your analysis, ladies. For Pallavi, in case of difficulties in addressing a reform of the subsidies and countervailing measure agreements based on the common concerns of humankind, as we have no much reason to be optimistic at this point, what do you think is needed to push this agenda at the regional or plurilateral forum? For Tang, to what extent is there space to undertake the global health crisis and investment-related policies in a multilateral forum? Have the WTO efforts helped in any aspect? Has the G20 supervision of investment policies during the COVID crisis at least mitigated any possibility of disputes under the bilateral investment treaties? My second point about the shared concerns is that 3 of the 4 papers, Pallavi, Tang, and Gu, are looking and testing better frameworks for cooperation, collaboration, and I would say adaptability. Lee, on a different note, proposed a thought-provoking new framework to qualify alternative policies and colliding discourses instead of keeping what she names as neoliberal perspective of international legal order, aimed at a linear and harmonized perspective. Her quantum perspective provokes us to go beyond exploring reforms of the current rules and their exceptions in place. If I understood well, she relocated the dominant narrative of securitization in a polysystem of different trends. Not only the crisis, meaning it as a shift on ontology and perception of international trade law. So, how Lee understand the proposal of critique and reform presented in the 3 papers on environmental sound technology, global health, and digital technology? What are their elements or perspectives that you think that are still linked to what you identified as neoliberal perspective or to a close geopolitics understanding? What are the missing elements in each paper for quantizing their analysis? If you can provoke the others speakers here. I enjoy very much this movement that you propose us, requalifying this perception of crisis in a pluralistic narrative. I would, however, be curious to have in context the Asia-Pacific region countries and cultures. Or are those countries disputing this narrative? Or should we better test this analysis framework to different types of stakeholders, not only states, but maybe different types of movements that you can find or identify in the region? Now, getting down to the paper separately, a question and comment to each of you. To Pallavi, you apply mostly the notion of dissemination of clean technology, but there are parts that you also apply the wording transfer of technology. At the end, it was not clear to me if your option in reforming the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement would be empower the transfer or access to technology. I also had a comment about the structure of the paper that is slightly different from your presentation. In the case of the paper, you have your normative claims based on Cotier doctrine in the first section, and then the descriptive analysis of the problem. In that case, the doctrine seemed too top-down and less convincing to me. And in the presentation, the other way around. Maybe here is a suggestion for you to think about the future structure of the paper. I should also comment that coming from a developing country, there is a suspicion of who would benefit from the application of that theory in a concrete situation. So I think it would be interesting to explore that, how much that idea of focusing on access to technology instead of transfer of technology, it would not increase the asymmetry of countries that are able to really innovate and really be part of this transformation for clean energy in the world. I also have comments to Chongming Kiru that I'll leave here for her. Maybe in the future she can access the comments. I found very interesting the way that she described the different contributions of the agreements for digital regulation, but she also mentioned the potential interplay of the data-related provisions in the different agreements. My question to her would be if she would see differences among the cases, among the agreements under analysis, which of them have been more or less flexible? What are the possibility of conflicting decisions under the dispute settlement systems that she found, especially for cases in which one agreement is addressing the cases to be analyzed by the dispute settlement, for example, of the CPTPP? How would these dispute settlements, that is one, be addressing different types of commitments, maybe even between the same partners of the different agreements? One suggestion to her in the paper she offered was to give maybe more examples of the wording of the agreements, with examples of clauses and the comparison of the black letters. I think that could facilitate the access to the reader and even the reasoning of the paper. To the paper offered by Tan, it would be interesting to have more explicit the different types of exceptions in the paper. Your case analysis support mostly the cases for general exception claims. However, countries are mostly applying exceptions for their investment policies based on national security concerns, including the health policies that were developed during the pandemics. National security discourse have been developed in domestic regulation as part of the autonomy. How do you think arbitration panels would decide upon such domestic policies based on security claims? Do countries need an explicit exception or rule to invoke this right? That's a provocation to you. I missed a little bit the context of investment facilitation negotiation at the WTO. From your point of view, how it conflicts or empower responses to global crisis, this different type of framework for an investment agreement. What do you think that could be considered the perspective of Asia-Pacific countries about this facilitation perspective? And to me, my question is, to what extent the quantum perspective go beyond the work of critical theory? You provoke us in mentioning that international law is what we make of it. And I think this is the point of departure of critical theory. So I would like to understand better, what are you adding to that perspective? I was curious the way, I know it's not an easy at all work, is to prepare the figures. But figures 1 and 2 in the paper that were slightly different in your presentation today, but they are mostly binary. They are kind of plotting the extremes. I was wondering how to redesign them under the quantum perspective. How would you mix those ideas and situations? Point about the case, the examples that you brought about energy regulation and securitization. It seems to me that this is one history, the history of traditional energy security. That is, and the scholarship, international scholarship, is more connected to gas supply and its dependence by European states that mobilizes the Energy Charter. But there have been very different forms of governance for energy interdependency. And it depends mostly on the profile of states and market actors, as well as of geographical conditions. As an anecdote, I think while reading your paper, I was thinking about the cases of Brazil and, for example, its energy cooperation in a trilateral partnership with Argentina and Paraguay in Itaipu, that is one of the largest hydropower plants in the world, and the way that Brazil regulated the import of gas from Bolivia, that is completely different of what we find in the Energy Charter. I suppose that if you could bring other examples in contrast to the cases you are analyzing, it would empower your argument with the potential of amplifying the quantum perspectives even to other moments of history, not only the current moment. I would maybe suggest you this sort of exercise. Another point that came to my eyes is that your approach seems to me very close to the law and development scholarship and even the work of International Economic Law Collective. But I didn't see you in dialogue with this scholarship, and I think that maybe accessing them and thinking about this could empower your analysis too. So I still have time, but I think that I'll end here. Thank you again for the opportunity to read and comment your works, and looking forward for the discussion. My last word is to thank all CBEL team in the name of Professor Wei-Huan Zhu and Professor Jonathan Bonilla. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for such detailed and thought-provoking comments and very important suggestions and questions. So I'm sure the speaker may want to have a quick reaction to your comments. And in the meantime, I'm aware that I'm very glad to know that when the Dr. Qu Xiaomeng is now able to join us, so we'll be able to share her screen in a moment. So I will quickly introduce her and then pass the floor to her before I will be inviting every speaker to give quick response. So Dr. Qu Xiaomeng joined the School of International Law, Southwestern University of Political Science and Law as postdoctoral fellow in June 2021, after finishing her PhD here with us at UNSW Law and Justice. Her current research focuses on international economic law, particularly international trade, regional economic relations, and China's regulation of data flow. She is also a member of China ASEAN Legal Research Center, School of International Law, Southwestern University of Political Science and Law. So we're very glad that she is finally with us. So I will now pass the floor to Xiaomeng.
Thank you. Thank you for, I'm Xiaomeng Qu from the School of International Law, Southwest University of Political Science and Law. Thanks for your invitation. And it's a great honor to be invited to this workshop. Today I'm going to talk about digital governance in the Asian Pacific. the title of my presentation entails two major questions. First is, what is the Asian Pacific's approach to governing digital trade? The second is how the regulatory experience in the Asian Pacific may facilitate international cooperation in the WTO. I will spend most of my time to discuss the first question, which will lay the foundation for the discussion of the second question. So to consider the first question, a necessary first step is to reflect on the current landscape of digital trade agreement in the Asian Pacific. We know that digital trade is among the most dynamic sectors in the global economy. However, at the same time, it has posed threats to security and privacy, leading to various restrictive government policies among countries in the world, as shown on, in the figure on the right side. However, there are no global rules in this regard, which will be discussed later. In response, the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement, has been the main approach to digital trade governance, and the primary laboratories for new rules. The regulatory framework has also become more comprehensive. It has evolved from digital trade rules to separate chapters on digital trade or e-commerce, and to standalone trade agreements. As we see from the figure, the Asian Pacific has the highest level of restrictiveness. So how the Asian Pacific countries react to the regulatory challenges brought about by digital trade? This is not a complete list of agreements, but it shows the Asian Pacific have played an active role to promote and liberalize digital trade. So we can see some of the earliest provisions and chapters can also be found in the region. Nowadays, the most important trade agreements that have digital trade rules are the two mega regional trade agreements, the CPTPP and RCEP, and also the first digital-only trade agreement, DIPA. They make distinctive contributions to digital trade law and representative active regional cooperation in the Asian Pacific. So they're the focus of my talk. In this sense, the Asian Pacific FTAs take a similar but progressive, more ambitious and expansive approach. So how to understand the Asian Pacific approach? Here I offer three general perspectives. First, the Asian Pacific trade agreements go considerably further in terms of scope and depth. The scope of these agreements become wider as they not only include provisions on traditional digital trade issues, such as paperless trading and online consumer protection, but also tend to incorporate several new issues, such as the source code, the emerging technologies, such as financial technology and artificial intelligence, as discussed by our speakers in the previous panel. In addition, the Asian Pacific digital trade rules become more ambitious on traditional digital trade issues. Specifically, they add more details in these areas and therefore introduce more legal requirements to the parties, as well as strengthen the enforceability of the agreements. So from this perspective, in my view, the Asian Pacific generally adopt a pragmatic approach to digital trade governance, that is, advancing rules on traditional digital trade issues while incorporating new age issues on a gradual basis. Second, the negotiation pattern and regulatory framework have experienced significant changes in the Asian Pacific region. Asian Pacific countries have shown much interest in negotiating digital-only trade agreements these years, which allow parties to avoid cross-sector trade-offs and complex and cumbersome negotiation process as exemplified in the normal FTA negotiations. With regard to the regulatory framework, the 3 trade agreements become more open, flexible, and inclusive. So to start with, they all include open accession process to encourage other countries to join the membership. Also, these agreements contain several soft commitments for emerging or contentious issues, thereby leaving the parties sufficient regulatory autonomy to accommodate the diversity of digital agreement and allow them to implement the commitment flexibly. In addition, the agreements all take an inclusive approach to the developing world and to the disadvantaged groups. Specifically, they give special and different treatment to developing countries and the least developed countries, and open up new opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises as well as vulnerable people such as women and children. So in my view, the changes in negotiation patterns and regulatory framework also reflect a pragmatic and gradual approaches that is focusing on the negotiation of digital trade issues while gradually promoting regional or even the global economic integration through the expansion of membership and the bridge of digital divide in practice. Third, the key issues in digital trade governance have evolved from data flows to those promoting the efficiency, trust, and interoperability. We all know that data flows and data localization have been key issues of digital trade negotiations over the past decade. However, WTO members have notable divergence on it. I will come back to this issue later. So to solve this old divide, the CPTPP, RCEP, and DPA all include provisions that generally support the free flow of data across borders and prohibit data localization requirements. However, they all incorporate exceptions or non-litigation requirement. In doing so, they have achieved a compromise between reducing trade barriers on the one hand and preserving policy space for the parties on the other hand. Meanwhile, the Asian Pacific policymakers devote extensive attention to issues that are of the highest economic relevance and issues that can bring immediate and substantive benefits to business, such as digital trade facilitation, consumer trust, and interoperability building. So in short, on the whole, the Asian Pacific adopts a gradual and pragmatic approach to digital trade governance that accommodates countries with diverse digital development and ideology preference. Now this leads to the second question of my talk: what lessons the WTO can learn from the Asian Pacific practice? Before that, we need to explore the challenges faced by WTO in this area. The WTO has made efforts to address the digital trade issues ever since 1998, but due to many problems, such as the current problems in the negotiation functions in the WTO, so unfortunately, there's no any agreement on digital trade. Instead, what we have today is the Joint Statement Initiative, GSI negotiations on e-commerce, which is launched in 2019. According to the co-conveners of the GSI, good convergence has been achieved in several areas, such as online consumer protection, electronic signatures and authentication, spam, transparency, paperless trading. But divergence remains on key issues. The co-conveners specifically mentioned the issues of development, data flows, and data localization, where the three main players, the US, the EU, and China, have different approach due to different interests and regulatory philosophy. Now, the GSI is seeking an inclusive and balanced outcome, and the US and China have involved in the digital trade governance in the Asian Pacific. Therefore, from my perspective, the Asian Pacific approach might be a feasible model for WTO to accommodate members with diverging policy preferences on digital regulation. So here's the summary of the Asian Pacific approach that I have discussed, and the green boxes on the right side are possible solutions to the issues of data flows and development. So first, for the data flows issue, drawing on the Asian Pacific experience, commitments to cross-border data flow and prohibition on data localization can be included in the future agreement. But exceptions such as public policy objective should also be incorporated to preserve policy space. Otherwise, the developing members and least developed members are unlikely to accept these provisions. It is reported that the US is withdrawing proposals on free flow of data in WTO negotiations. So it is very likely to achieve convergence on a soft approach in this issue. Second, for the development issue, I think following the Asian Pacific experience, two types of provisions could be introduced to the future global rules. One is a special and different treatment provisions. Future agreements should provide flexibility to developing countries and least developed countries to implement their commitments. Another type of provisions is inclusive provisions which require robust technical assistance and capacity building to bridge digital divide. These rules will not only benefit developing countries, but also developed members. Due to the time limitation, I won't be able to elaborate further on this point. Finally, what I want to say is that despite the progress of digital trade governance in the bilateral and regional forum, the WTO remains to be the best place for digital trade regulation. It will not be easy to reach an agreement in the WTO, but it's urgent to move forward. The 13th Ministerial Conference emphasizes 13 present an opportunity. So let's wait and see what pragmatic and positive outcomes might be delivered next year. Well, that is what all I have for today. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Xiaomeng, for the interesting presentation. And I'm glad that you were finally able to join us and make the presentation of the very interesting paper. And I think it addresses, also offers some, important Asian Pacific experience perspective in the digital trade governance. And as you mentioned in the end, that the Asian Pacific experience may also have important implication for WTO, and also in terms of offering a model perhaps to facilitate international cooperation in the digital trade. So we now have about 15 minutes for Q&As, and before I then pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Weihuan Zhou, for concluding remarks. So I think in the interest of time, so Michelle have offered some really thought-provoking questions that you may want to react to it. I might just collect those questions also from, we have a couple of questions also from the audience. So I will give each speaker probably a chance to address the questions, including your reaction to Michelle's comments or questions. Okay, so we'll probably in this order of, in the order of the way you speak. So I'll first pass it to Pallavi. So there are some questions also from the audience. Apart from tax breaks, what other policy instruments are necessary to facilitate technology transfer, and how this instrument may impact international trade? And also, I wonder, since you mentioned this question about the doctrine, the common concern of humankind, right? To what extent this doctrine can be viewed as an legal binding obligation into international law? So could this normative framing bind the home country of the innovator companies to provide tax breaks for the transfer of LCTs to developing countries? So if you could make a response to those questions together, and also if you want to react to Michelle's comments.
Right, thanks a lot to the audience for the questions, and us to Professor Bardhan for very insightful and thought-provoking comments, and for suggestions to better organize my working paper. I will start with the questions from the audience. The first being that what are the other measures with respect to promoting technology transfers other than tax breaks by the home country? So the first could be tax breaks by the host country so as to attract foreign direct investment, but this may implicate international investment law where it may be considered as a performance requirement, for example. The other measure could be an export credit support for trade in low carbon technologies. And just like tax breaks for incentivizing exports of technology, credit support for export of technology, again, may fall foul of Article 3 of the SCM agreement and may be considered an export contingent subsidy. Then the third idea around this is revenue recycling in the context of CBAM. So whatever revenue is generated as part of the EU CBAM regulation should actually be diverted to countries from which it is taken so that they can implement sounder technology measures and adopt such measures for turning to renewable processes. Then the next could be compulsory licensing, whereas we've already highlighted that a drawback of compulsory licensing is that it does not give us access to know-how. And so there could also be a rethink around whether there can be a compulsory licensing of know-how or undisclosed information as well. Then developing countries could effectively apply their competition policy to tackle voluntary licensing practices that are abusive or competition distorting. And then a more radical idea along the lines of what we saw in the context of COVID-19 was a complete waiver of IP rights, which was very hard to come by even in the context of the pandemic. So it seems equally implausible in the context of LCTs as well. And then one idea, of course, could be that if the technology is publicly funded, then it should be open source. So these are some of the thinkings around other mechanisms to promote technology transfer. Coming now to Professor Bardhan's comments and questions. So I'll start with the first comment, which was about whether measures to promote tax incentives by home countries be located under the WTO, under the auspice of the WTO, or whether regional or plurilateral or bilateral agreements could also be used to that effect. And I think my paper was remiss in pointing this out, but I do feel that free trade agreements could actually be a better forum to actually implement these measures and policies. One, because the negotiating arm of the WTO has been in limbo, with the fishery subsidies agreement also not being finalized during MC12. And so the free trade agreements actually offer a possibility for countries to bilaterally agree on these commitments. And until the doctrine of common concern of humankind actually acquires the status of customary international law, including these as treaty obligations under free trade agreements could be helpful. So free trade agreements now have sustainability chapters where countries are required to adopt non-product related process and production methods. And this commitment could be made contingent also upon a commitment to offer tax breaks for transferring technologies to developing countries. So I think free trade agreements do offer that space to developing countries to put these demands on the table and have them as negotiated outcomes. Pools or patent pools, as we saw in the context of COVID-19. But our experience from COVID-19 also shows us that without an incentive, private companies are actually not very willing to submit their technologies, their know-how to patent pools or technology transfer mechanisms. And therefore, the notion of incentive becomes very relevant even in that context. So those would be my initial remarks to that question. Thank you very much for your comments on the structure of the paper with respect to my engagement with the normative framework of common concern of humankind. While writing it, I also realized that I was quite disengaged from it and the two were kind of operating in parallel, and that does provide me with enough food for thought for greater alignment between the descriptive part and the normative parts of the paper. Also, thank you very much for pointing out the discrepancy in interchangeably using the terms transfer, dissemination, and diffusion. I do understand that they actually connote different aspects where dissemination could also be effected through having stronger IP protections, whereas transfer would require concrete measures towards entering into voluntary licensing agreements. And I think my intent here was to encapsulate the whole array of diffusion, dissemination, and transfer. And I think I should kind of have made that clear right at the outset of the paper. So I think with that, I will draw my comments and interventions to a close, and thank you wholeheartedly, Professor, for your very insightful comments, and also to the audience and other members for this very wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pallavi. And now I would like to move to Dr. Xinyue Li. So there are a few questions from the audience that I will collect together. You can pick it up. So I would ask the speaker trying to be brief so that everyone have a chance to react. So very briefly, so there's two questions that related to your approach, and it's very interesting that you link international economic law, international relations, and physics, which is a very refreshing approach. The question is, can you explain why you choose physics, and have you tried combining other disciplines with international law? Another question is whether we should regard this quantum international law as a theoretical framework per se, or as a research methodology. If the latter, then does that include any quantitative legal studies? Another question is more specific than how exactly the theoretical framework you seek to develop would inform the interpretation and application of the security exceptions. I do think existing WTO case law is compatible with that framework. So if you can be briefly trying to address some of those questions and maybe Michelle's remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun, and thank you everybody for your brilliant and very insightful questions. And so regarding the first one, and I think it just come to me very naturally, because if you ever visited Cambridge in 20th centuries, you will notice that the law school and the physics department and also the philosophy department are within the same building. And so basically all of the philosophers have this kind of philosophy, and then the philosophy will engage with the physics studies, and vice versa. So they all just nurture each other and they help each other to develop. And this is how science become the fundamental philosophy for all social science, which you can tell by a lot of the very famous work, such as Auguste Comte, because he said people are social atoms, and also Adam Smith introduced Newtonian physics as a way of economics because we have invisible hand, and also Karl Marx and Samuel de Floyd and etc. And so for me, physics is really just the fundamental of everything. And if you are ever interested, I would suggest any law students, don't be afraid of science. Don't be afraid of mathematics and physics. The way we use it is as a philosophy instead of really engage with, quantitative method, because we're not there yet. Regarding the second questions, yes, so it is a theoretical framework, and it can also be used as a research methodology. And my work is currently working on to build quantum international relations, which is a very pluralistic and ambitious scholarship, may I say. So we will see where we list that to you. And regarding the third questions, and I'm assuming it probably be posted by Wei Huan. Thank you on that. And so just to clarify, my research is not trying to inform the interpretation or application of security exceptions, so to speak, because there are so many missing steps from a theoretical framework to the practical of international law. And so what I'm trying to do, the gap I'm trying to fill is between non-law and law, between politics and law. And so it's more about the way we think. It's more about how to change the model we think from a very Newtonic things that everything has to follow a pattern to the world we're currently in, because according to the Attorney General of WTO, she said we are in the world of polycrisis. So this is when we really need to shake our minds a little bit. And regarding to Michelle's questions, so first of all, thank you, Michelle, for reading a very lengthy and complicated work on a very exotic theory. And I really truly appreciate your time and energy. And for all of your questions, I don't have time to address all of them today, but I would like to say that all of them will inform my further research. I'm particularly thankful for your remarks on what Asian can do, using this kind of framework, because I am working on a project which is titled Beyond Transnational Legal Pluralism, Quantum International Law Series for Asian Narratives, which aims to develop quantum international law to subtly and strategically offer Asian narratives for the study or the interpretation of international law. So we will see in the future. And lastly, I just want to say I have a question. And in the end of your remarks on my research, Michelle, you said some scholarship is very similar to my work, but I just miss which kind of scholarship. Could you say that name again for me? Thank you.
Sure. MAI is just about law and development and the International Economic Law Collective that are based more on the critics, and so maybe they can empower your work.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate, and so lovely to meet all of you, and thank you, Sibo, for organizing everything, and thank you.
Thank you so much for these remarks. Now for our next speaker, so Ms. Yi Tang. So there's a question from the audience about what major developments in the interpretation of general exceptions and other dispute settlement forums outside the WTO. Has the WTO jurisprudence been followed or deviated?
Okay, thank you, Professor Michelle and Professor Fan, so much for the very inspiring and helpful comments and questions. So I probably will first respond to a point raised by Professor Michelle first, and then I will respond to the questions raised by our audience. So respond to the point regarding elaborating more on other types of exceptions clauses, such as national security exceptions. Yes, I would say that I do need to think more about that, because in my current paper, I only focus on general public policy exceptions. And I indeed agree with what Professor Michelle and also Dr. Qingyue has just mentioned, that nowadays the scope of national security exceptions actually has expanded to include more non-traditional security concerns, including public health. So in this regard, I will definitely consider improving my article on that point. And to respond to the questions on the interpretation of general exceptions clauses by other dispute settlement body, I have to admit that I actually do not include other dispute resolution body. Apart from WTO body and the International Investment Arbitral Tribunal, I have not included any other kind of probably public international law dispute resolution body. But first, I would like to mention that if we compare the ISDS cases or the Investment Arbitral Tribunal jurisprudence with the WTO cases, we may find that the interpretation of general exception in WTO cases is much more clarified and consistent. This is because the WTO agreements and jurisprudence are more established, and there is a longer history in WTO in addressing the general exceptions. And as I mentioned in the presentation, the WTO system has already established the two-tiered or the three-step analysis when approaching the general exceptions clauses. But by contrary, the ISDS Investment Tribunal so far only addresses the general public policy exceptions in very few cases, and their interpretations seem to be neither clear nor consistent. And from the existing investment arbitration cases, it seems that the Investment Tribunal has not followed the two-tiered reviews, the two-tiered review or three-step analysis that has already been established by the WTO jurisprudence. So from my personal opinion, I think the WTO approach is more satisfactory, and the investment arbitral tribunals may draw some lessons from the established WTO jurisprudence and give more careful consideration to analyzing this particular type of general public policy exceptions. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that currently there are two other pending cases exactly involving the same IIAs as the case of Equal Oral versus Colombia that I have just introduced. So it remains to be seen like whether the future tribunal will provide us with more clarity. And finally, I would like to briefly argue that this should be in my concluding part, actually, to achieve the broader goal of balancing the investment protection and the host state's regulatory space to protect public interest. I think a holistic or a bulk reform is actually required. So merely focusing on reforming the treaty clauses may not be sufficient. So a holistic reform involving both IIA's treaty regime and ISDS mechanism will be much more beneficial. So that would be my response. And thank you, everyone. And I'm really glad to share today's workshop with other wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we would like to turn to our last speaker, Dr. Xiaomeng Qu. So there's also some questions from the audience for you. One question is how governments in Asian Pacific may accommodate their difference in their regulatory priorities and approaches to achieve more convergence in regulating digital trade. And also perhaps if you want to comment on what role China has played in digital trade governance in the Asian Pacific region. And if you want to also react, I hope you heard also Michelle's comments and questions if you want to have a quick reaction.
Many thanks for the question. In my view, I think first the parties should focus on the issues that matter to the most economically and that can create immediate and substantive benefit to the business, as I have mentioned in the presentation. Second, countries have different regulatory priorities. Good consensus on a single set of digital trade rules on these issues is unlikely for the foreseeable future. So like-minded countries should work toward shared principles and institutional arrangements to promote convergence on this issue. So one possible way, in my view, is to couch these issues in social norms or best endeavor commitments. This will leave sufficient space for parties' domestic policy. Meanwhile, I think parties should create a formal forum for an ongoing conversation on this issue, such as the formal dialogue on e-commerce holding by the RCEP Joint Committee. I think these consultation-based mechanisms and soft law norms or guidelines for contentious issues will provide an opportunity for the parties to share their best practice and address these contentious issues on a gradual basis. So that's my perspective on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to really take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers and commentators for the wonderful presentation on such a diverse range of topics, which also have some common concerns. As Michelle has commented, I've learned a lot from reading your papers and hearing your presentations. So thanks for all the audience for being here with us. And I would now like to pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Weihuan Zhou, for concluding remarks. Weihuan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Quinn, and thank you, Michelle, and all of the speakers in the Young Scholar Workshop. Despite some technical issues, I think it actually ended up with a very well interactive and engaging discussions, and I hope that Michelle's comments will help you in your research and also career development in a long way. And as Michelle said, you may contact her if you have any questions or you want to engage more with her on the research you are doing. And by the way, personally, I think you guys are doing a very, very important research on some very cutting edge issues, not only from the practical perspective, but also from a theoretical perspective. So thank you so much. It has been a enormously productive and thought-provoking conference in the past 3 days, including today's Young Scholars Workshop. So, dear colleagues and friends, I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words as closing remarks of this conference. Again, SABLE is proud to have organized this conference and is very thankful for all speakers and participants for your support, engagement, and insights. Without your contributions, this conference would have not been so successful. In the past 3 days, we had 6 sections, including 1 keynote, 4 panels, and 1 Young Scholar workshop. A total of 21 presentations, if I count correctly, but for sure, very interactive discussions on a wide range of questions raised by the audience. Almost 400 colleagues registered, and many of them attended. We hope that this conference, particularly the presentations and discussions in the past 3 days, would make a contribution to the ongoing academic and policy debates on some of the most systemic and existential challenges for global economic governance. We hope that some of these works and discussions would make their way into actual policy making at domestic and international levels. Let me also thank our team, Fionn, Hannah, Alice, and Licia, who have worked extremely hard on all aspects of the conference preparation. Their work and expertise is highly appreciated, is indispensable for the success of this conference. Finally, let me just say that the discussions in this conference is merely a start. Continuous efforts and commitments in academic and policy studies are required for us to overcome these challenges facing the world economy. And this needs to be done through collective efforts. With that, we hope you have enjoyed the conference and look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.